Democracy in Ukraine, from ancient roots to modern challenges. Hello, this is Artis Freeman, speaking from my apartment in central Kyiv, Ukraine. Today is July 12, 2025. In recent days, the district has come under heavy Russian airstrikes, drones, and missiles, some reportedly manufactured with Chinese assistance. Since Donald Trump's return to office, the frequency of these attacks has increased fivefold compared to Biden's term. Almost every night, the soundscape is marked by the whistle of incoming missiles, the hum of drones, and the sharp response of Ukrainian air defenses. In this charged atmosphere, I aim to explore Ukraine's democratic journey, its origins, evolution, and present-day trials. I've been living in Ukraine for over a year. I was born in China in 1985 under an autocratic regime and spent 38 years of my life there. I understand deeply how terrifying it is to live without freedom. Eventually, I immigrated to the United States, where I worked for Apple and served in the US Navy. The freedom I found there was profoundly satisfying, but at times surreal. Like a poor child being suddenly invited to Disneyland, constantly fearing he will be asked to leave and handed an enormous bill. My interest in Ukraine began in 2014, when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. But it was the images of Russia's full-scale invasion on February 24, 2022, that truly shook me. Shock, disbelief, rage, empathy, inspiration, and even depression. In my view, many Ukrainians are like me, born into the prison of Soviet system, having tasted freedom, now facing the threat of losing it all over again. Their struggle is not only about their own fate. It directly concerns the post-World War II international order built by the US, the UK, and other allies. An order grounded in human rights and the rules of law, and forced through the sacrifice of millions of lives and immense national wealth. If Ukraine falls, so does the world order. Since arriving in Ukraine in April 2024, I've been living on this land for over a year. During this time, I've only returned briefly to the United States once, and traveled across several European countries 5 times for volunteer work related to Ukraine, while also taking the opportunity to observe several former communist sibling nations, such as Poland, Slovakia, and Czech Republic, discovering the real Ukraine. Over the past year, I've traveled across the country, the Donbas front lines in the east, Kharkiv in the northeast, Kyiv and Chernobyl zone near Belarus in the north, Lviv and Urhud in the west, Kherson, Odessa, Mykolaiv in the south, and several rural regions in between. I've lived with young Ukrainians, spent nights in trenches with soldiers, debated social issues with journalists and professors, negotiated rent with landlords, and discussed democracy and development with my Ukrainian friends. I've also visited national landmarks, like the National Museum of Ukraine and the local museums in different cities. What moved me the most? Seeing Ukrainians go about life despite air raid sirens, watching people kneel quietly as convoys of fallen soldiers pass by, witnessing protest signs and billboards featuring ordinary soldiers, not a single image of a political leader. President Zelensky does not dominate public spaces like Xi Jinping. Through books and documentaries, I've been trying to answer a core question. How has democracy taken root, evolved, and been challenged on this land? Under the shadow of information warfare. My research and personal experience revealed that much of what circulates about Ukraine is distorted or entirely false. Russian and Chinese state propaganda actively spread misinformation worldwide, and unfortunately, even some Ukrainians are misled. I once met a retired Russian-speaking high official who believed Ukrainians and Russians are one people and blamed the West for provoking the war. In Odessa, I met a restaurant server who also spoke Russian as her first language. She believed the Russian media narrative that the West was trying to invade Russia, forcing Putin to wage war on Ukraine. She even hoped Putin would one day rule Ukraine. Among all the misinformation, the worst is the denial of democracy. In early 2022, when Putin's army invaded Ukraine, most Chinese people I met said Ukraine wasn't a real democracy. They called Zelensky a puppet of the US. By the 2025, different claims came from the US. People said Zelensky was a dictator, meaning he refused to follow the US control. But most Ukrainians, especially those who speak Ukrainian, see it very differently. I'm glad to say almost everyone I've met who speaks Ukrainian as their first language in Ukraine firmly supports democracy. The Ukrainian language is undergoing a powerful revival. In public spaces, Ukrainian has overtaken Russian, a shift unimaginable before the war. Russian was once dominant outside Western cities like Lviv. Now, even in places like Kharkiv, more people are switching to Ukrainian, reflecting a profound awakening of national identity. The historical roots of Ukrainian democracy, ancient democratic traditions. Democracy has developed in waves throughout human history. The most successful earliest practice began in ancient Greece with Athenian democracy. Ukraine lies near the Black Sea, close to ancient Greece. The influence is clear. In Odessa, Greek ruins remain. They show this land was once part of the Greek world. Although Athens fell and Rome rose, the Roman system kept democratic elements. Power wasn't in one person's hands. It was shared by the Senate, emperors, consuls, and tribunes. They spoke for different interests, including the people. This sharply contrasted with Eastern autocracy. Roman influence reached Ukraine through the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium. Kiev's princes admired Byzantium and sought to imitate it. Kiev's St. Sophia Cathedral reflects that style. Some coastal areas fell under Byzantine control. This era marked a key chapter in the development of Ukrainian civilization. As Europe emerged from the hardships of Middle Ages, Ukraine played a meaningful role. The Cossack Republic's experiments in self-governance became a key chapter in democracy's early evolution, before the system reached full maturity. The rise of modern constitutional democracy and its first major reversal. Modern constitutional democracy emerged only in the past few centuries, led by the United Kingdom and the United States. The 1688 English Bill of Rights laid the legal foundation for citizen rights. America's 1776 Declaration of Independence and the 1787 Constitution institutionalized freedom, equality, and electoral governance. On April 6, 1789, George Washington became the first modern leader elected under a constitutional framework, lighting the way for countless people seeking liberty. Democracy spread through worldwide, especially Northern and Western Europe. Its first major wave peaked around World War I. The US joined the UK and other allies. Russia's empire collapsed. The Ukraine declared independence in 1917 as the Ukrainian People's Republic. That republic became a symbol of self-determination. President Wilson's self-determination principle inspired freedom movements worldwide, but the rise of Soviet power soon crushed Ukraine's democratic hopes. By 1922, Ukraine was absorbed into the USSR. This Soviet triumph also fueled the rise of fascism and Nazism, while democratic states like the US and UK drifted into appeasement. Thus began democracy's first major retreat. a dark chapter under Soviet rule. Under Soviet rule, Ukraine endured what can only be described as a living hell. Between 1932 and 1933, the man-made famine known as Holodomor killed around 7 million Ukrainian people, over 10% of population. Ukraine, once a land of abundance and known as the breadbasket of Europe, would never have faced famine under a free democratic system. The tragedy happened because a tyrannical dictatorship ignored the view of Ukrainian people and seized their entire grain harvest, turning prosperity into mass starvation. World War II and the new wave of democratization. At the start of World War II, many Ukrainians, desperate under Soviet oppression, leaned toward supporting Nazi Germany, believing Hitler was less cruel than Stalin. They hoped that by joining forces against the Soviets, Ukraine might win its independence. But Hitler's evil racial policies crushed those hopes. Ukrainians were branded as inferior and suffered brutal violence, including massacres and looting. The majority of Ukrainians were forced by Stalin's regime into joining the Red Army to fight against the Nazis, caught between two brutal powers. As one of the main battlegrounds of the war, Ukraine was devastated. Over 10% of the population killed in combat. The Ukrainian people made enormous sacrifice to help the Allies secure victory. However, toward the end of the war, democratic nations, led by the US and the UK, adopted a policy of appeasement toward the Soviet Union to avoid further casualties. In reshaping the post-war world map, they kept making concessions to the Soviet Union. Ironically, the strongest power, the United States, did not expand its territory at all. The United Kingdom, despite its vital role, lost many of its territories. The Soviet Union, rescued from collapse by the US and the UK, emerged with vastly expanded borders. Ukraine was once again enslaved by the Red Empire, tightly bound to Moscow's war machine aimed at the democratic world. Only almost half a century later did freedom return. In 1991, Ukrainians overwhelmingly voted for independence, even in regions heavily populated by ethnic Russians like Donbas and Crimea. It was a moment of triumph for democracy. Delayed integration and a renewed resolve. After independence, Ukraine could have followed its post-communist peers, drawing the democratic world through the EU and the NATO. But Russian interference and deep internal political divisions fractured public opinion. It wasn't until the 2014 Revolution of Dignity and the annexation of Crimea that most Ukrainians truly awakened. For the first time, polls showed that over half of its population supported joining NATO and the EU. Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 only strengthened the support. Today, an overwhelming majority across all Ukrainian regions favor joining NATO and the EU. In contrast, countries like Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland unified their national will early on and joined these institutions soon after independence. Now they enjoy peace, prosperity, and full integration with the democratic world, while Ukraine needed more than 20 extra years to reach that same level of unity. At the crossroads of civilization. The deeper I've come to understand Ukraine, the more I realize that today's war is not only just about land or resources. It is a battle between two civilizational paths, democracy and autocracy. The outcome will shape whether humanity moves forward toward liberty or slides back into the shadow of tyranny. If Ukraine fails, it is not just the downfall of a 40 million strong Eastern European nation. It is the collapse of a rules-based global order and a defeat for human civilization. This war is a turning point in world history. It is the final clash between two civilizations, and a decisive battle in the greater movement of democratic progress. That's why I hope to give a series of lectures exploring the story of democracy in Ukraine and the broader question facing us all. Will the democratic journey be interrupted or will it continue? The answer matters not only for Ukraine's future, but for the future of humanity itself.